The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Lowell Hall, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors of the lecture room. Dr. James Harrington adjusted his glasses and surveyed the eager faces of his students. At 52, he had established himself as one of Harvard's most distinguished physics professors. With 3 best-selling books and a reputation that attracted students from around the world to his advanced theoretical physics course. As we discussed last week, he began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the tiered lecture hall. Einstein's field equations give us a framework for understanding how matter and energy affect the very fabric of spacetime. He turned to the whiteboard, marker in hand, and began writing a series of complex equations with practiced confidence. The scratching of pencils and the soft tapping of laptop keys filled the room as students hurried to keep up. 20 minutes into his lecture, the heavy oak door at the back of the hall creaked open. Dr. Harrington paused mid-sentence, irritation flickering across his face as he looked up. It wasn't unusual for students to arrive late occasionally, but he made it clear from day one that punctuality was non-negotiable in his class. But it wasn't a student who entered. An elderly woman, perhaps in her late 70s, slipped quietly into the back row. She wore a simple blue cardigan over a floral dress, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Most striking was the worn leather notebook she clutched in her wrinkled hands. Dr. Harrington frowned. Community auditors were permitted in some classes, but his advanced course was typically reserved for enrolled students. He made a mental note to speak with administration about tightening access to his lectures. As I was saying, he continued with a pointed glance at the newcomer, the implications of these equations extend far beyond what even Einstein himself initially recognized. The lecture continued, and Dr. Harrington gradually forgot about the elderly woman as he lost himself in the elegant mathematics of relativity. That is, until the question and answer period at the end of the class. Several hands shot up, and he called on a young man in the front row. "Dr. Harrington, could you explain again how the tensor calculations account for gravitational waves in extreme conditions?" The professor smiled. This was his element, simplifying complex ideas for bright young minds. "Excellent question. Paul, when we consider massive objects like neutron stars..." He moved through 3 more questions from his regular students, each one giving him the opportunity to showcase his expertise. Then from the back of the room, a weathered hand rose hesitantly into the air. The elderly woman was leaning forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. Something about her quiet confidence made Dr. Harrington uncomfortable. He considered ignoring her, but the students had noticed, and several were glancing back curiously. "Yes," he said finally, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been with the other students. The woman's voice was soft but clear. "I wonder if you might address the inconsistencies that arise when applying these field equations to quantum-scale phenomena." A ripple of whispers spread through the lecture hall. It was a sophisticated question, one that touched on the holy grail of modern physics, the elusive unified theory that would bridge quantum mechanics and general relativity. Dr. Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite an ambitious question, Ms. Wilson," she replied. "Margaret Wilson." "Well, Ms. Wilson," he said, not bothering to hide the condescension in his voice, "what you're referring to is far beyond the scope of today's lecture. Perhaps you might benefit from one of the introductory physics courses offered to the general public through the Extension School." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The dismissal was unnecessary and obvious to everyone in the room. Margaret Wilson didn't flinch. "I understand it's complex," she said calmly, "but I've been reading about recent attempts to reconcile these theories, and I wondered if you might have insights on how the loop quantum gravity approach addresses these inconsistencies compared to string theory models." The silence that followed was thick with tension. The question revealed not just a passing interest but a deep understanding of cutting-edge theoretical physics debates. Dr. Harrington felt a flush creep up his neck. Being challenged was rare enough. Being challenged by someone he had mentally dismissed as a confused elderly auditor was unsettling. "Loop quantum gravity remains highly speculative," he said curtly. "If you're interested in the topic, I suggest reviewing the published literature. Now, if there are no further questions relevant to today's material, you're all dismissed." The students began packing up their notebooks and laptops. Many glanced curiously at Margaret, who sat quietly making notes in her leather-bound book. seemingly unbothered by the professor's dismissal. As the hall emptied, Dr. Harrington gathered his materials, stealing occasional glances at the elderly woman. She was in no hurry, carefully writing in her notebook with a fountain pen that looked as old as she was. There was something oddly familiar about her concentrated expression, but he couldn't place it. When most students had filed out, Margaret finally closed her notebook and rose stiffly from her seat. She made her way down the steps with careful deliberation, one hand gripping the railing. Dr. Harrington busied himself with his laptop, pretending not to notice her approach. But she stopped directly in front of his desk and waited patiently until he could no longer ignore her presence. "May I help you with something else, Ms. Wilson?" he asked, not looking up from his screen. "I appreciate you allowing me to sit in on your lecture," she said. "It's been many years since I've been in a classroom setting." "This course is typically reserved for enrolled students," he replied. "While Harvard embraces community engagement, some advanced courses require proper academic background." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Of course. I wouldn't want to disrupt your teaching." Something in her tone made him look up. There was no offense in her expression, only a quiet dignity that made him feel suddenly small despite his impressive credentials. "May I ask what brings you to an advanced theoretical physics lecture?" he asked, curiosity temporarily overcoming his irritation. Margaret smiled slightly. "Old habits, I suppose. The mind needs exercise just like the body, especially at my age." Before he could respond, a young teaching assistant appeared at the door. "Dr. Harrington? The department meeting starts in 5 minutes." "Thank you, Lisa," he said, turning back to gather his things. When he looked up again, Margaret Wilson was already making her way toward the exit, her pace unhurried but purposeful. As the door closed behind her, Dr. Harrington found himself staring at the empty doorway, an unexpected feeling of unease settling over him. There had been something in the old woman's eyes when she asked about quantum gravity, a sharp intelligence that contradicted her frail appearance. He shook off the feeling and headed to his meeting. Harvard attracted all types, he reminded himself. Cambridge was full of educated retirees with time on their hands. Still, as he walked across the leaf-strewn yard toward the physics department, he found himself wondering about Margaret Wilson and her worn leather notebook filled with careful notes. He didn't notice her sitting on a bench beneath an ancient oak tree, watching him pass by, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she opened her notebook once more and continued writing complex equations that would have astonished him had he seen them. The next day's lecture, Dr. Harrington decided, would include a particularly challenging problem, one that would remind everyone, including unexpected visitors, exactly why he held one of the most prestigious chairs in theoretical physics at Harvard University. Sleep did not come easily to Dr. Harrington that night. The encounter with Margaret Wilson had left him more unsettled than he cared to admit. There was something about the elderly woman that nagged at his thoughts. The precision of her question, the quiet confidence in her eyes, the worn leather notebook filled with what he assumed were carefully copied notes. By morning, his unease had hardened into determination. He would reassert his authority in today's lecture. After 20 years at Harvard, he had earned his reputation, and he wasn't about to let it be questioned by an elderly auditor who had wandered into his classroom. He arrived early to Lowell Hall, setting up his materials with unusual care. On the whiteboard, he wrote an equation. Not just any equation, but one that had stumped physicists for years. It wasn't directly related to his planned lecture, but it would serve his purpose. As students filed in, Dr. Harrington noticed several of them glancing toward the back row. Following their gaze, he saw Margaret Wilson already seated, her blue cardigan replaced by a gray one today, but the same leather notebook open on her lap. She was early this time. The sight of her strengthened his resolve. He began his lecture with more energy than usual, weaving through complex theories with practiced ease, dropping names of famous physicists he had collaborated with, and referencing his own published works. The students were captivated, scribbling notes frantically as he spoke. "Before we continue with today's material," he said about halfway through the lecture, "I'd like to address an interesting problem." He gestured to the equation on the board. "This has been a particular challenge in the field. It relates to quantum entanglement across significant space-time curvatures." A murmur ran through the class. This wasn't on the syllabus, and it certainly wasn't something they'd be tested on. Still, it was fascinating to watch their celebrated professor tackle such a notorious problem. Perhaps, Dr. Harrington continued, his eyes finding Margaret in the back row, our visitor might have some thoughts on this particular challenge? Ms. Wilson, since you expressed such interest in quantum phenomena yesterday, would you care to enlighten us? The students turned in their seats, expressions ranging from curiosity to embarrassment on behalf of the elderly woman now center of attention. Dr. Harrington allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He wasn't being overtly cruel, merely making a point about respecting the boundaries between serious academic pursuit and casual interest. Margaret Wilson closed her notebook slowly and looked up. For a moment, Dr. Harrington thought he saw something like disappointment in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a calm resolve. Are you asking me to approach the board, Dr. Harrington? She asked, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent hall. By all means, he replied, gesturing grandly toward the front of the room. We're all eager to learn. The silence grew heavier as Margaret rose from her seat. She moved slowly down the steps, her hand on the railing, the leather notebook tucked under her arm. A few students shifted uncomfortably, sensing the professor's intent. Others watched with undisguised curiosity. When she reached the front of the room, Margaret set her notebook on the desk and studied the equation on the board. Dr. Harrington offered her a marker with an exaggerated courtesy that made a few students wince. Take your time, he said, checking his watch obviously. Though we do have a lecture to complete. Margaret took the marker without comment. She stood before the board for what felt like a long time. Her head tilted slightly as she considered the equation. Dr. Harrington began to feel a flicker of regret. Perhaps he had gone too far. He was about to intervene to say something that would allow them both to save face when she began to write. Her hand moved across the board with surprising steadiness. There was no hesitation in her strokes, no pausing to reconsider. Line after line of mathematical notation flowed from her marker, building upon the original equation, transforming it through a series of steps that Dr. Harrington didn't immediately recognize. The murmuring among the students grew louder. Dr. Harrington stepped closer to the board, his brow furrowed in concentration. What had begun as a simple demonstration of his authority was turning into something else entirely. This approach, Margaret said quietly as she worked, considers the problem from a different angle. Instead of trying to resolve the quantum entanglement directly across curved space-time, we can apply a transformation that, she continued explaining as she wrote, her voice growing stronger, more confident. The specialized terminology flowed naturally, her understanding of the concepts clearly deep and intuitive. This was not someone who had memorized formulas or copied notes. This was someone who lived and breathed theoretical physics at its most advanced level. Dr. Harrington felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. He recognized what she was doing now. She was applying a mathematical approach that had only recently been proposed in a paper out of MIT, but she was extending it, taking it further than the original authors had. And it was working. A graduate student in the front row suddenly gasped. That's brilliant, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She's resolving the paradox by treating time as emergent rather than fundamental. Margaret paused, turning to the student with a genuine smile. Exactly. The temporal dimension becomes a consequence of quantum interactions rather than a stage for them to occur on. She turned back to the board and added a final line to her solution, circling the result with a flourish that belied her age. The room erupted in spontaneous applause, startling both Margaret and Dr. Harrington. As the clapping died down, an uncomfortable silence fell. Margaret capped the marker and placed it carefully on the ledge beneath the board. She turned to Dr. Harrington, who stood frozen, his expression unreadable. Thank you for the opportunity, Dr. Harrington, she said softly. It's been some time since I've worked through a problem on a blackboard, or whiteboard as it is now. Dr. Harrington cleared his throat. Yes, well, that was unexpected. Thank you, Ms. Wilson. He struggled to regain his composure. You seem to have some familiarity with the field. A student in the second row raised her hand tentatively. Professor, isn't that approach similar to what Dr. M.E. Wilson proposed back in the 70s? The emergent time hypothesis? Dr. Harrington blinked, the name registering slowly. M.E. Wilson. Margaret E. Wilson? He turned to look at the elderly woman with new eyes, taking in the intelligent gaze, the confident posture that now seemed obvious despite her physical frailty. "Dr. Wilson?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded once, a simple acknowledgement without pride or resentment. "It's been a long time since anyone has addressed me by my professional title. I left academia many years ago." The students looked between the two professors, confusion giving way to understanding as they witnessed the recognition dawning on Dr. Harrington's face. "For those who don't know," he said, his voice strange to his own ears, "Dr. Margaret Wilson was a pioneer in theoretical physics during the 1960s and 70s. Her work on quantum field theory was revolutionary." He paused, memories of graduate school textbooks flooding back. "And then you disappeared." "There were rumors." "Life takes unexpected turns," Margaret said simply. "I had personal reasons for stepping away from public academic life. But I never stopped working." She patted her leather notebook. "Some problems required decades of thought." One of the graduate students had pulled out her phone and was frantically searching online. "Oh my God," she whispered loudly. "There are only 3 published papers by M.E. Wilson, but they're cited in practically every major work on quantum gravity for the past 40 years. She's a legend." Margaret laughed softly. "Hardly a legend. Just an old woman who loves physics." She turned to Dr. Harrington. "I should let you continue your lecture. Thank you for indulging me." But Dr. Harrington couldn't simply return to his planned material, not now. "Perhaps," he said, finding his voice at last, "you would consider telling the class a bit about your work? Your current work, I mean, if you're still active in research." Margaret studied him for a moment as if gauging his sincerity. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded. "I would be happy to share some thoughts," she said, "though I wouldn't want to take over your class entirely." "I think we would all benefit from hearing what you have to say, Dr. Wilson," he replied. And this time the respect in his voice was genuine. As Margaret Wilson began to speak about her decades of solitary research, Dr. Harrington found himself taking a seat among his students, listening with growing amazement to the woman he had tried to humiliate just minutes before. The class that day ran long and not a single student left early. Word spread quickly through Harvard's physics department. By the following morning, the story of Margaret Wilson's impromptu lecture had reached most faculty members, though each retelling seemed to add new details. Some versions claimed she had solved 3 impossible equations. Others suggested she had reduced a room full of graduate students to tears with the beauty of her mathematics. Dr. Harrington sat in his office, staring out the window at the autumn leaves drifting across the quad. On his desk lay a stack of academic journals from the 1960s and 70s that he'd pulled from the university archives. The few papers authored by M.E. Wilson were dog-eared and well-read, their margins filled with notes from generations of physics students. He'd spent most of the night reading her work, rediscovering ideas that had shaped his own understanding of quantum mechanics during his student days. It was humbling to realize he'd never connected the groundbreaking papers with the quiet elderly woman who had wandered into his classroom. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening in his chair. Lisa Chen, his teaching assistant, entered with an excited expression. "Dr. Harrington, everyone's talking about what happened yesterday. Is it true that Dr. Wilson agreed to come back and speak to the class again?" He nodded. "She did, though I'm not entirely sure she'll follow through. I got the impression she's grown accustomed to her privacy. But why did she disappear in the first place?" Lisa asked, perching on the edge of a chair. "Her work was so influential. Professor Greenberg in quantum theory said she was decades ahead of her time." Dr. Harrington shook his head. "I don't know. There were rumors back then. Personal tragedy, academic politics, health issues. Nothing concrete." He tapped one of the journals. "After her 3rd major paper in 1976, she simply vanished from academic circles. No more publications, no conference appearances. And now she just shows up in your lecture?" Lisa's eyes widened. "That can't be coincidence." "No," he agreed. "I don't believe it was." Before they could discuss further, another knock came at the door. This one was softer, hesitant. "Yes?" Dr. Harrington called. The door opened slowly to reveal Margaret Wilson, looking much as she had the day before. Simple clothes, silver hair in a neat bun, and that worn leather notebook clutched in her hands. The only difference was a pair of reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Dr. Wilson, Harrington said, standing quickly. Please come in. Lisa stared openly at the elderly woman, then caught herself and extended a hand. It's an honor to meet you, Dr. Wilson. I'm Lisa Chen, Dr. Harrington's teaching assistant. Your paper on quantum field fluctuations was part of my undergraduate thesis research. Margaret smiled, shaking Lisa's hand. How lovely to hear. Though I suspect the field has moved well beyond those early ideas by now. Not as much as you might think, Dr. Harrington said. Your work has been foundational. He gestured to the journals on his desk. I've been reacquainting myself with your publications. Margaret glanced at the yellowed pages with a mixture of recognition and distance, as if looking at photographs from another lifetime. It seems like a different world now. An awkward silence fell over the room. Lisa looked between the two professors and quietly excused herself, closing the door gently behind her. Dr. Harrington cleared his throat. I owe you an apology, Dr. Wilson. My behavior yesterday and the day before was inexcusable. Margaret waved away his words. You didn't know who I was. And frankly, I've grown accustomed to being invisible in my old age. It happens to most women past a certain point. There was no bitterness in her tone, just a matter-of-fact observation. That's no excuse for rudeness, he insisted. Regardless of who you were or are, I should have shown more respect. She studied him for a moment, then nodded, accepting his apology without further comment. She moved to the window, looking out at the campus with a wistful expression. It's changed less than I expected, she said softly. The buildings are the same, the trees a bit taller perhaps. Only the people are different. Dr. Harrington joined her at the window. You were here at Harvard? For a time. I was never given a permanent position, of course. Women weren't back then, but I had a research fellowship for several years. She turned to face him. That's not why I'm here now, though. Why are you here, Dr. Wilson? He asked. The question had been burning in his mind since yesterday. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She moved to a bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of physics texts, some of which likely contained her own work. I've been working on something, she said finally, for decades now, mostly alone. I thought I had solved it, the unification problem, but there were gaps in my approach that I couldn't see because I'd been looking at it too long. Dr. Harrington felt his pulse quicken. The unification problem, the holy grail of theoretical physics, a unified theory that would reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity. Generations of brilliant minds had tried and failed to solve it. I needed fresh eyes, she continued, new perspectives. So I started attending lectures, reading current research. She smiled slightly. I chose your class because I read your book on quantum loop gravity. It was quite good, though I disagreed with some of your conclusions. Despite himself, Dr. Harrington felt a flush of pride at her words. You've actually solved it? The unification problem? Not entirely, she admitted. But I believe I'm close. Closer than I've ever been. She patted her notebook. It's all in here. 40 years of work. He stared at the worn leather volume with new reverence. Dr. Wilson, if what you're saying is true, this could be the most significant breakthrough in physics since Einstein. Perhaps, she said, neither confirming nor denying the magnitude of her claim. But I need help with the final pieces. I'm old, Dr. Harrington. My mind isn't as sharp as it once was, and the mathematics required for the last steps is challenging. I would be honored to assist in any way, he said immediately. But surely there are more qualified. I chose you, she interrupted gently. After reading your work and attending your lectures, I believe you have the right combination of creativity and rigor. You're not afraid to challenge established thinking, but you don't ignore the fundamentals either. Dr. Harrington was speechless. Just days ago, he had been at the height of his career, confident in his place in the academic world. Now he felt like a student again, humbled by the presence of this remarkable woman who had been working in obscurity all these years. There's something else you should know, Margaret said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. The reason I left academia wasn't just about being a woman in a male-dominated field, though that certainly didn't help. She opened her notebook to a page filled with equations and diagrams. My last published paper hinted at something that frightened me, a theoretical application of my work that could have devastating consequences if developed into technology. Others were beginning to see it too. I received inquiries from government agencies, defense contractors. Dr. Harrington frowned. What kind of application? Energy manipulation on a quantum scale, she said simply. In the wrong hands, it could be weaponized. I couldn't bear the thought of my life's work leading to more efficient ways to destroy life, so I disappeared. Let the world think I had given up or gone mad or died. But you never stopped working, he said. Understanding dawning. No, I kept searching for a way around the problem, a version of the theory that would allow for beneficial applications without the destructive potential. She tapped a complex equation in her notebook. And I believe I've found it. Dr. Harrington's mind raced with the implications. If she was right, her work could transform human understanding of the universe and potentially lead to technological advances beyond imagination. The world needs to know about this. Dr. Wilson, he said earnestly, your work should be published, shared with the scientific community. That's why I'm here, she replied. But it needs to be verified, refined. I can't publish until I'm certain about the safety implications. She looked him directly in the eyes. Will you help me with that, Dr. Harrington? It would mean working in secret for a time until we're sure. It was an extraordinary request, to set aside his own research, to work without the recognition of publications or conferences, to potentially share in one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs of all time, or to waste months on the delusions of a once brilliant mind now past its prime. Dr. Harrington looked at Margaret Wilson, really looked at her. Behind the wrinkles and silver hair, he saw a fierce intelligence that had never dimmed, a dedication to truth that had sustained her through decades of solitary work, and a wisdom that recognized both the wonder and danger of true discovery. I would be honored, he said, and in that moment, he meant it more sincerely than any words he had ever spoken. Margaret's face broke into a genuine smile, relief evident in her eyes. Thank you, James, she said, using his first name for the first time. I think this is the beginning of something remarkable. As they bent over her notebook together, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the office, two brilliant minds separated by age and experience, but united in the timeless pursuit of understanding the universe. 3 weeks passed in a blur of equations, late nights and endless cups of coffee. Dr. Harrington cleared his schedule as much as possible, delegating lectures to his teaching assistants and postponing committee meetings. His colleagues noticed the change, but he deflected their questions with vague references to a special research project. The truth was far more extraordinary than anyone could have guessed. Each day, Margaret Wilson arrived at his office carrying her leather notebook, and together they dove into the depths of theoretical physics that few minds had ever explored. They worked in Dr. Harrington's office at first, but the constant interruptions from students and faculty soon became too disruptive. Margaret suggested they move their collaboration to her small apartment in Cambridge, a short walk from campus. The first time Dr. Harrington visited, he was struck by the simplicity of her living space. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled not only with physics texts but also philosophy, history, and classic literature. A small desk by the window was covered with papers and notebooks. The furnishings were modest but comfortable, with a well-worn armchair positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. I've lived here for 30 years, she explained, setting a cup of tea before him. The landlord thinks I'm just a retired librarian. He keeps the rent reasonable since I never cause trouble. It was in this unassuming apartment that they made their first breakthrough. After days of working through Margaret's equations, Dr. Harrington spotted a pattern that had eluded even her. Look here, he said excitedly, pointing to a sequence of mathematical expressions. If we apply the tensor transformation before introducing the quantum variables, the entire system simplifies. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes widening as she followed his reasoning.
Yes, she breathed.
Yes, that works. And it eliminates the potential energy extraction that concerned me. They worked through the night, barely speaking except to exchange ideas or challenge each other's assumptions. By dawn, they had refined the approach into something elegant and profound. It's beautiful, Dr. Harrington said, staring at the final equation. In its simplicity, it reminded him of Einstein's EMC2, yet it contained worlds more information about the fundamental nature of reality. Margaret smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening with genuine joy. It is, isn't it? And I believe it's safe now. The applications this points to are about understanding, not weaponization. As the weeks passed, their collaboration deepened. Dr. Harrington found himself in awe not just of Margaret's brilliance, but of her approach to science itself. Where he had always been driven by ambition and recognition, she pursued knowledge for its own sake, with a humility that now seemed to him like true wisdom. "Why didn't you publish under a pseudonym?" he asked her one evening as they shared a simple dinner after a long day of work. "You could have continued your contributions without revealing your identity." Margaret considered the question, stirring her soup thoughtfully. "I considered it. But science isn't just about adding knowledge to the world, it's a conversation, a community endeavor. Without being able to discuss my ideas, to defend them and refine them through debate, publishing seemed pointless. So you chose complete withdrawal instead." "I chose a different path," she corrected gently. "I freed myself from the pressure of publication, from academic politics, from the constant race to be first. It allowed me to think deeply, to follow ideas to their conclusion without worrying about grants or tenure or reputation." Dr. Harrington felt a pang of recognition. How often had he rushed a paper to publication, knowing it needed more work simply to maintain his standing in the field? How many potentially groundbreaking ideas had he abandoned because they wouldn't yield quick results? "I've been thinking," he said, changing the subject slightly. "We need to bring someone else into this. Someone we can trust. The mathematical modeling required for the final proof is beyond what either of us can do alone." Margaret looked alarmed. "James, we agreed to keep this between us until we were certain." "I know," he assured her. "But I'm thinking of Lisa Chen, my teaching assistant. She's brilliant with computational modeling, and she's already curious about you and your work. More importantly, I trust her completely." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "You've changed, James," she said finally. "When we first met, you would never have suggested sharing credit for a discovery of this magnitude." He felt his face warm with embarrassment, knowing she was right. "Perhaps I've remembered why I became a physicist in the first place. It wasn't for the accolades." She smiled at that. "Very well. Invite your Lisa to join us, but she must understand the sensitivity of what we're doing." The next day, Dr. Harrington pulled Lisa aside after a department meeting. Her eyes grew wider and wider as he explained the situation in carefully chosen words. "You've been working with Dr. Wilson?" "The Dr. Wilson?" she whispered incredulously. "On a unified field theory? And you want me to help?" "This stays absolutely confidential," he stressed. "No one can know what we're working on until we're ready to publish." Lisa nodded solemnly. "Of course. When do I meet her again?" "Tonight, if you're free. We're working at her apartment now." That evening, the three of them gathered around Margaret's dining table. Initial awkwardness quickly gave way to intense discussion as Lisa absorbed the scope of their work. Her computational expertise proved invaluable, identifying potential approaches to test their theories that neither Margaret nor Dr. Harrington had considered. "This is incredible," Lisa said, looking up from her laptop where she'd been running simulations. "If these numbers hold up in larger models, you've done it. You've actually unified quantum mechanics and general relativity." "We've done it," Margaret corrected her gently. "Science is rarely the work of a single mind, no matter what the history books say." As Lisa continued working on her computer, Dr. Harrington noticed Margaret watching the young woman with an expression he couldn't quite place. There was pride there and something like wistfulness. "She reminds me of myself at that age," Margaret said quietly, following his gaze. "So much energy, so many ideas. I hope she has better opportunities than I did." "Times have changed," Dr. Harrington replied. "Not enough, perhaps, but there's progress." Margaret nodded. "That's why this work matters, James. Not just for the science, but for what it represents. Breaking boundaries, questioning assumptions, in physics and beyond." Their conversation was interrupted by Lisa's excited voice. "The large-scale simulation worked. The model predicts exactly what your equations suggest. A fundamental connection between gravity and quantum forces that no one has demonstrated before." The three of them stared at the screen, watching as colorful visualizations confirmed what they already believed to be true. They had done it, achieved what generations of physicists had been working toward for nearly a century. "What happens now?" Lisa asked, breaking the awed silence. Dr. Harrington looked to Margaret. This was her life's work, her decision to make. "Now," Margaret said slowly, "we prepare to share it with the world. But carefully. This knowledge comes with responsibility." Over the following days, they drafted a paper outlining their discovery, Margaret insisted that all three names appear as co-authors, despite Dr. Harrington's argument that her contribution far outweighed theirs. Legacy isn't about claiming credit, she told him firmly. It's about ensuring the work continues after we're gone. As they finalized their manuscript, rumors began to spread through the physics department. Dr. Harrington's unusual absence from his normal routines had not gone unnoticed, and his sudden interest in computational modeling raised eyebrows among his colleagues. The department chair, Dr. Eleanor Powell, finally confronted him after a faculty meeting. "James, what's going on? There are whispers about you working with some mystery woman. If you're onto something significant, the department should be involved." Dr. Harrington hesitated. They weren't quite ready to go public, but keeping their work secret much longer seemed impossible. "I can't tell you everything yet, Eleanor," he said carefully. "But yes, I'm working on something important. More important than anything I've ever done. And soon, very soon, I'll be able to share it." Dr. Powell studied him with narrowed eyes. "This better not be something that embarrasses the department. James, your reputation has always been solid, but lately, your behavior has been erratic. Trust me," he said with a confidence he'd never truly felt before meeting Margaret. "What we're working on will bring nothing but honor to Harvard." What he didn't tell Dr. Powell was that the honor would come not from his own achievements, but from the long overdue recognition of a woman who had quietly changed the course of physics from the shadows. Margaret Wilson was about to take her rightful place in scientific history, and he was proud to play even a small role in making that happen. As he walked back to Margaret's apartment that evening, Dr. Harrington felt a profound sense of peace. His career had been built on ambition and ego, but in helping Margaret he had found something more valuable: purpose beyond himself. Whatever came next, whether acclaim or controversy, he would face it with a new understanding of what truly mattered in a life dedicated to science. The grand lecture hall of the physics department was filled beyond capacity. Students sat in the aisles, professors stood along the walls, and a handful of journalists from scientific publications fidgeted with recording devices near the front. Word had spread rapidly after the announcement. Dr. Margaret E. Wilson, the long-vanished physics pioneer, would be presenting a paper on a unified theory of quantum gravity, co-authored with Harvard's Dr. James Harrington and his assistant Lisa Chen. In the small preparation room behind the stage, Margaret adjusted her simple blue dress, the same color as the cardigan she had worn when she first walked into Dr. Harrington's classroom 2 months earlier. Her silver hair was arranged in its usual neat bun, but today she wore a single pearl pendant that had belonged to her mother. "Nervous?" Dr. Harrington asked, straightening his tie for the third time. Margaret smiled. "At my age, there are few things left to be nervous about. Though I admit it's been decades since I've spoken to an audience larger than my cat." Lisa rushed in, her arms full of printouts. "The final simulation results are perfect. Every test confirms the predictions." She stopped, noticing the tension in the room. "Are you both okay?" "Just pre-lecture jitters," Dr. Harrington assured her. "A normal part of academic life, though I suspect Dr. Wilson has had a longer break from it than most." A knock at the door signaled it was time. Dr. Eleanor Powell, the department chair, entered with an expression caught between excitement and lingering skepticism. "We're ready for you," she announced. "And I must say the turnout is remarkable. We've even got people watching a video feed in the overflow room." Margaret took a deep breath and picked up her worn leather notebook, a symbolic gesture, as their presentation was now contained in a sleek digital slide deck prepared by Lisa. Then we shouldn't keep them waiting. As they walked onto the stage, the buzz of conversation died immediately. All eyes fixed on the small elderly woman who moved with deliberate steps to the podium. For most of the audience, this was their first glimpse of the legendary Emmy Wilson, whose papers they had studied but whose face they had never seen. Dr. Powell introduced them with barely contained excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my extraordinary privilege to present Dr. Margaret E. Wilson, returning to Harvard after an absence of nearly 50 years, along with our own Dr. James Harrington and doctoral candidate Lisa Chen." The applause was thunderous. Margaret adjusted the microphone and waited for silence to fall again. "Thank you for that warm welcome," she began, her voice stronger than her frame might suggest. "As some of you may know, I stepped away from public academic life many years ago. Today I step back not to seek recognition for myself, but because the work we're about to share is too important to remain hidden. She glanced at Dr. Harrington, who nodded encouragingly. They had agreed he would handle the technical portion of the presentation, given his experience with modern academic lectures. Dr. Harrington will guide you through the mathematics of our discovery, Margaret continued. But first, I'd like to offer some context about why this work matters beyond the equations themselves. For the next 15 minutes, she spoke without notes about the decades-long quest to reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity. She explained complex concepts with simple analogies that made them accessible even to the undergraduates in the audience. There was no showmanship in her delivery, just clarity and the quiet authority that comes from complete mastery of a subject. In essence, she concluded, we've been trying to force two languages to communicate without a proper translation dictionary. What we're presenting today is not just a theory, but a new language that speaks to both the cosmic and quantum realms simultaneously. As she stepped back, Dr. Harrington moved forward. The contrast between them was striking. He in his tailored suit with his polished presentation style, she in her simple dress with her old-fashioned notebook. Yet the respect in his eyes as he thanked her was unmistakable. What Dr. Wilson has modestly introduced, he began, represents the culmination of over 40 years of persistent inquiry. While I've had the privilege of contributing to the final stages, the foundation of this breakthrough belongs to her remarkable vision. For the next hour, he led the audience through the technical details of their unified theory, with Lisa managing the complex visualizations that illustrated their points. When questions came, and there were many, the three collaborators answered as a team, each deferring to the other's strengths. Toward the end of the presentation, a well-known physicist from MIT raised his hand. This is extraordinary work, he acknowledged, but I'm curious why Dr. Wilson disappeared for so long, especially when she was clearly pursuing such important research. A murmur ran through the crowd. It was the question everyone had been wondering but had been too polite to ask directly. Margaret stepped forward again. That's a fair question, she said. The simple answer is fear, not of failure, but of success. She explained, without self-pity or drama, how her early work had attracted attention from those who saw its potential for weaponization, rather than understanding. How, as a woman in a male-dominated field, she had lacked the institutional power to control how her research would be applied. How she had chosen to step away rather than see her life's work twisted into something destructive. I continued my research in private, she said, searching for a path that would lead to knowledge without enabling harm. What we've discovered now opens doors to understanding the universe without the concerning applications of my earlier approach. The hall was silent when she finished. Then slowly people began to stand. The applause started softly and grew until it filled the room completely. It wasn't just academic appreciation. It was recognition of the courage it had taken to make such a choice, to prioritize ethics over recognition, to persist in solitude for decades without guarantee of success. As the formal presentation ended and the audience crowded forward with more questions, Dr. Powell pulled Dr. Harrington aside. James, she said quietly, the university wants to offer Dr. Wilson a position, an endowed chair in theoretical physics with complete research freedom. No teaching requirements, no administrative duties. Dr. Harrington smiled. She'll refuse. What? Why would anyone refuse such an honor? Because Margaret doesn't work for honors or positions, he explained. But offer it anyway, and when she refuses, be ready with a different proposal. Funding for a small research institute focused on ethical applications of theoretical physics, with spots for promising students who might otherwise be overlooked. Dr. Powell looked at him curiously. You've changed, James. A few months ago, you would have been fighting to have your name first on the paper, not advocating for someone else's vision. He nodded, watching as Margaret patiently answered questions from a circle of awestruck graduate students. Let's just say I've received an education that wasn't on the curriculum. Later that evening, the three collaborators gathered in Margaret's apartment one last time, before the whirlwind of academic fame would truly begin. The paper was already being downloaded thousands of times across the world, and interview requests were pouring in. What will you do now? Lisa asked Margaret as they shared a celebratory cake she had baked. With the theory published, I mean, Margaret smiled, touching her old notebook. There are still questions to explore. Always more questions. but perhaps not alone anymore. Dr. Harrington raised his teacup in a toast. To questions without end. And to unexpected teachers, Lisa added, looking at Margaret with undisguised admiration. Margaret's eyes crinkled with pleasure. You know, she said thoughtfully, when I walked into that classroom 2 months ago, I wasn't entirely sure what would happen. I only knew that after decades of working in isolation, I needed new perspectives. You certainly found them, Dr. Harrington chuckled, though perhaps not in the way you expected. The best discoveries rarely come the way we expect, she replied. That's what makes science and life so interesting. 6 months later, a small building on the edge of Harvard's campus was dedicated as the Wilson Institute for Theoretical Physics. Its mission statement, displayed in the modest lobby, contained a quote from Margaret. Knowledge without wisdom is just information. Wisdom without compassion is just calculation. True science requires all three. Dr. Harrington, now the Institute's co-director alongside Margaret, had it framed above his desk. It reminded him daily of the elderly woman who had walked into his classroom and changed not just his understanding of physics, but his understanding of what it meant to be a scientist and a teacher. In the years that followed, their unified theory would be tested, refined, and eventually confirmed, earning them recognition that extended far beyond academic circles. But for Dr. Harrington, the real breakthrough had been more personal, learning humility from the woman he had once tried to humiliate, and finding that in stepping back, he had actually moved forward in ways he never could have imagined. As for Margaret Wilson, she finally took her rightful place in the pantheon of physics giants, proof that brilliance sometimes hides in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to shine.